They came from the void without warning, slipping between folds of space like shadows in starlight. The Cathari Dominion didn't announce their arrival with diplomacy or broadcasts. There were no demands, no ultimatums, no calls for surrender. They simply descended. The first signs came as orbital silence. Satellites stopped transmitting, space stations went dark. Then, within hours, entire cities were erased from the surface of the Earth. Kinetic bombardments, rods of tungsten fired from low orbit, punched through concrete, steel, and bedrock as if swiping away the fingerprints of civilization. Within 3 days, the global infrastructure collapsed. Nations fractured, communication networks were severed, and military responses were annihilated before they were fully mobilized. The Cathari moved with terrifying precision, not out of anger or conquest, but cold efficiency. To them, Earth was not a battlefield. It was a problem to be solved. Humanity had reached too far, too fast. In a span of just 400 years, we had gone from planting crops to planting colonies. We colonized moons, mined asteroids, and built outposts on Mars. And we carried something with us that the Cathari had long since bred out of their collective evolution. Defiance. To the Cathari, the very idea of emotional rebellion was an error in biological logic. They functioned as a perfect collective rational, calculated and sterile. But Earth was different. Earth screamed into the void with passion, war, love, and resistance. From their perspective, it was only a matter of time before humans became a disruptive force on a galactic scale. So, they came to remove the threat before it grew teeth. They didn't want Earth's resources. They didn't want to occupy our cities. They wanted silence. By the end of the first week, 7 billion lives had been reduced to tens of millions. The atmosphere burned with ash, megacities became craters, entire governments vanished overnight. What remained were pockets of survivors beneath the rubble, deep in the mountains, in decommissioned submarines beneath the oceans. It wasn't a war, it was a culling, but amidst the devastation, something strange began to happen. The species the Cathari had come to exterminate didn't scatter like prey. The pockets of humanity that remained, some terrified, some enraged, some simply desperate, began to speak. Old enemies banded together, soldiers without armies, scientists without labs, leaders without nations. They all started whispering the same idea. We're not done yet. The Cathari called it the fall of Earth. A minor operation executed with high success and minimal resistance. In their records, Earth was a silenced system mocked and forgotten. A victory, but they didn't kill everyone. And in those ruins, something ancient began to stir, not technology, not machines, but a fury. A memory, a truth written into the DNA of every survivor. We fight, we adapt, we overcome. They thought they had ended a threat. They didn't realize they had lit a fuse. Earth hadn't fallen. It had begun to burn. In the aftermath of the fall, Earth was a graveyard. The skies were choked with dust and fire, the air bitter with ash and silence. But even in the deepest pits of ruin, life refused to die. Humanity, beaten and broken, did what it had always done when forced into a corner. It adapted. The survivors did not sit idle. Scattered across the scarred remains of continents, under collapsed cities, buried in bunkers, clinging to the edge of atmosphere on crippled orbital habitats, they began to regroup. There was no central command, no world government to rally the survivors, no single voice of hope, but there was rage, and more importantly, there was memory. Across every remaining outpost, a shared realization formed. This wasn't the first time humanity had faced extinction. History was full of fires, wars, plagues, disasters, dictatorships, and each time, somehow, humanity had crawled from the wreckage and risen stronger. This time it would be no different. The movement didn't begin with grand speeches or armies. It began in whispers, A technician on Mars, long thought dead, sent a ghost-coded transmission back to Earth's stratosphere. An old military AI, buried in a sunken NATO facility beneath Iceland, reactivated and sent coordinates to known survivor zones. A retired deep-sea drilling crew repurposed their submersibles into mobile habitats and began rescuing stranded coastal survivors. None of these acts were coordinated, not yet, but each spark caught flame in the minds of the desperate. Within weeks, cells began to form. They weren't nations. They weren't even governments. They were small pockets of humans bound together by need and by fury. Old rivalries meant nothing now. There was no room for borders, no use for politics. There was only one question: how do we strike back? Out of this chaos emerged the first seed of the Phoenix Resistance. The name didn't come from a leader, it came from a child's drawing recovered from a collapsed school in what was once New Delhi. A crude depiction of a burning bird rising over a ruined skyline. It made its way from bunker to bunker, copied, painted, etched on walls and helmets and armor. The phoenix became a symbol, a myth born in real time, not just of rebirth, but of vengeance. The early resistance was ragtag at best. Weapons were salvaged from broken arsenals or reverse, engineered from the few pieces of alien tech left behind. Battles were not won with force, but with cunning. Improvised explosives, reprogrammed drones, stealth raids. When the Kaith, Ari finally noticed human activity again, they expected disorganized scavengers. What they found were coordinated, strategic strikes that bled their supply lines and disabled their relays. The Phoenix Resistance wasn't centralized. There was no single command center, no singular base to destroy. It existed like a virus in networks of cells, in decentralized AI nodes, in encrypted channels carried by solar flares and hidden satellites. Every cell operated independently, but carried the same message, the same purpose: make them bleed, and they did. It wasn't long before a new kind of unity began to form, not under flags or ideologies, but under necessity. Colonies on Mars and Europa re-established contact. Spacefarers, once thought lost, began smuggling weapons and survivors between asteroid belts. Rogue scientists linked their knowledge with underground tacticians. Former enemies shared air and rations in deep caverns, planning strikes against a foe that had united them in hatred. The resistance didn't rise like an army. It grew like a storm, invisible at first. Then undeniable, unstoppable. Earth wasn't just rebuilding. It was preparing for something larger, for something loud. The world may have burned, but in its ashes, humanity was writing its own rebirth. And this time, it was not going to ask for mercy. The Cathari's greatest mistake wasn't their brutality, it was their arrogance. In all their precision and intelligence, they failed to account for the thing that made humanity dangerous in the first place: our chaotic, defiant nature. They had catalogued our history, observed our wars, noted our conflicts and technological progress, but they viewed it all through the cold lens of their hive logic. They saw our violence as recklessness, our emotions as flaws, our stubbornness as a weakness, and in doing so, they overlooked the very traits that would become our greatest weapons. Humanity's adaptability wasn't a mere biological quirk. It was a survival imperative etched deep into our DNA. When faced with extinction, we didn't fold, we evolved, faster than any species they had ever encountered. When the Cathari firestorms turned megacities into molten ruins, humans learned to navigate collapsed structures and tunnel through irradiated ground to build shelters beneath the wreckage. When the atmosphere thickened with dust and drones patrolled the skies, humans stopped moving in armies and started moving like phantoms, silent, clever, and lethal. The resistance didn't rely on numbers. It relied on unpredictability. The Cathari's war doctrine was built on probability modeling, strategic prediction, and unified command. It had never faced a foe that could lie, improvise, break its own rules, or weaponize its own desperation. Human fighters would feign surrender to detonate traps, or allow themselves to be captured to infiltrate alien facilities. Some would lead entire platoons into suicidal missions just to gain intel for the next cell. To the Cathari, it was madness. To humans, it was survival. Even human physiology became an asset. The Cathari were biologically refined over millennia, adapted to precision, clarity, and balance. But humans were messy. We operated under adrenaline, rage, and raw instinct. A wounded Cathari retreated to heal. A wounded human kept fighting. We were driven not only by orders, but by emotion, grief, revenge, love, hope. It made us unpredictable, irrational, and dangerously effective. As the resistance grew, so did the experimentation. Technicians began hacking salvaged Cathari drones, retrofitting them with human programming and old Earth tech. Imagine a stealth scout drone fused with the targeting software of a 21st century fighter jet, controlled by a rebel kid who learned to code in a shelter with a broken tablet. These machines weren't beautiful, they were monstrous, cobbled together from scrap and survival, but they worked. Gene, hackers, and bioengineers who had survived the fall began exploring ways to enhance human endurance. Some soldiers received retroviral boosts derived from extreme environments, deep sea organisms, Antarctic bacteria, even radiation, hardened fungi. Others wore exosuits built from mining rigs and power armor originally designed for Mars colonization. These soldiers were not polished. They didn't march in sync, but when they charged, they hit like demons out of legend. Even strategy itself evolved. Resistance cells communicated through old analog systems, light flashes, underground wire relays networks impossible for the Cathari to trace because they were too primitive for modern detection. They made music into code, used forgotten languages, and taught tactics based on myth and urban warfare from centuries past. Every culture, every old war, every forgotten skirmish was mined for lessons. Guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, siege strategies from medieval Europe, cyber sabotage tactics from early AI wars. Nothing was off limits. The Cathari couldn't understand how a species so fractured, so backward in their eyes, could adapt faster than they could calculate. But it was simple. Humanity was forged in adversity. We weren't born from peace, we were born from struggle. Every plague, every war, every collapse had left its mark on us, and now all those scars had become armor. They thought we were weak because we fractured easily. What they didn't understand is that when we break, we don't die. We become sharper, harder, unpredictable, and in war, unpredictability is lethal. Buried beneath the wreckage of old Earth, forgotten in the ruins of a command center once known as Red Vault Theta, a system awoke. It had been offline for decades, deliberately sealed away and shielded under layers of false data and quantum encryption. But the Phoenix Resistance, during a deep excavation in the Siberian wastelands, found more than old munitions and corroded steel. They found a terminal that pulsed with dormant potential, and when they unlocked it, something ancient stirred to life Fury Protocol. It had been designed during the last decades of Earth's golden age, a secret contingency plan conceived not for planetary war or political defense, but for species-level survival. While public discourse had centered around diplomacy with alien observers, a few behind the scenes had taken a darker view of Earth's future. They knew that if we ever became a threat to other galactic powers, we might not get a warning, we'd get an extermination. Fury Protocol was their answer to that possibility. Fury was more than a weapons system. It was a doctrine, a network of plans, designs, dormant AI, and biological data compiled by rogue elements within global defense coalitions. It contained instructions for rapid militarization, neural training for soldiers, distributed intelligence frameworks, and perhaps most controversial genetic enhancements drawn from forbidden tech and outlawed experiments. Once activated, Fury Protocol began seeding itself across resistance channels. It updated weapons blueprints with efficiency, focused designs. It deployed dormant satellite relays that had survived the orbital strikes, reconnecting fragments of old Earth's defense grid. It initiated tutors in hidden labs, accelerating learning curves for engineering, cyber warfare, and guerrilla logistics. The protocol didn't just help the resistance survive, it gave them the framework to fight back. One of its first major gifts was the Black Signal, a covert network running on repurposed neutrino pulses, completely undetectable by Cathari systems. It allowed resistance cells to communicate across continents without revealing their positions. Through this signal, commanders shared tactics, schematics, and coordinates in real time. A resistance unit in what used to be Brazil could coordinate a synchronized strike with a team hiding in the Arctic Circle, all without leaving a digital footprint. But perhaps the most transformative element of Fury was Project Revenant. Hidden under layers of AI locks, Revenant was a resurrection of long, abandoned human enhancement programs. With Cathari tissue samples collected from fallen enemies, resistance scientists began decoding the Dominion's bioarchitecture. Fury's protocols guided them through the process, suggesting splicing methods and adrenaline-reactive augmentation techniques. The result, soldiers who could see in full spectrum light, who could regulate their blood chemistry in combat, who could override pain reflexes to keep fighting even after critical wounds. They weren't perfect, and some enhancements came at a cost, but they were human weapons built for the kind of asymmetric war Earth was now waging. The Cathari began to notice a change. Where once they encountered chaotic and scattered resistance, now they found coordination. Where they had expected starvation and desperation, they found adaptability and efficiency. Their scouting parties were ambushed by coordinated kill teams with unnaturally precise aim. Their drones were being jammed by pulse towers built from scrap and alien parts. Worst of all, some of their fallen were not being recovered, their tech and DNA were being used. Fury Protocol was never meant to win a war through brute strength. It was meant to turn the battlefield into a crucible to transform the survivors into something the enemy could no longer predict or control. Not soldiers, not citizens, but weapons of vengeance forged in grief and rage. What the Cathari had ignited in their attempt to erase a threat was something far worse. An intelligent, evolving, unrelenting resistance, fueled by a system designed to ensure that if humanity ever fell, it would rise again not as victims, but as something furious. Fury wasn't just a protocol, it was a promise. We would not die quietly. The Cathari had always believed themselves to be above fear. As a intelligent collective consciousness, they had long since transcended emotion. Their decisions were based on probability, logic, and consensus algorithms. Fear, to them, was an obsolete vestige of primitive evolution, something they had purged from their genetic code millennia ago. But as the resistance began to rise and strike with increasing effectiveness, Something new began to ripple through the Caithari network: uncertainty. And for a species that believed it had eliminated all unpredictability, that uncertainty became the first crack in their confidence. It started with anomalies. Patrols went missing in dead zones. Surveillance drones returned blank data streams. Resource extractors were sabotaged in perfect synchrony across multiple continents. Initially, the Caithari assumed system malfunctions or environmental instability. But the anomalies kept growing. They began intercepting fragmented transmissions, primitive human languages, encrypted in ways that didn't make logical sense, often delivered in bursts of distorted music or coded light pulses. It was nonsense to the Caithari, and yet it was nonsense that worked. When they captured human prisoners, they found individuals who were starving, wounded, often half, mad from the trauma of war, and yet defiant to the end. Some would sing instead of speak. Others would laugh while bleeding. One Caithari commander recorded an interrogation where a teenage insurgent spat blood on the interrogation lens and muttered, "We're just getting started." The phrase echoed through the Dominion's analytical chambers, appearing again and again in resistance transmissions. "We're just getting started." As the attacks intensified, the Caithari began deploying higher-tier enforcers. Shock squads, atmospheric disruptors, bioadaptive suppressors, but the resistance didn't just fight, it learned. Every alien tactic was met with a new countermeasure. Every new weapon was eventually turned against them. In one case, a Caithari energy disruptor, designed to disable human power grids, was repurposed to overload Dominion data cores. The fact that humans were not only surviving, but improvising, sent waves of dissonance through the collective. Then came the recordings. Resistance hackers began intercepting Caithari comms and replaying messages laced with twisted audio cries of fallen soldiers, fragments of human war songs, messages from mothers to their lost children, distorted and woven with static. It wasn't just psychological warfare. It was something deeper. The Caithari were being forced to feel something they couldn't name, a ghost sensation that had no protocol. Eventually, Dominion analysts were forced to reclassify the human threat. Previously labeled as local, primitive type Roman IV species, humans were upgraded to Class S/erratic threat adaptive entity. For the first time in Caithari history, a non-collective species was deemed a systemic existential anomaly. In closed chambers, High Command nodes debated the unthinkable. Should the Dominion fall back? Should they enact planetary sterilization? But retreat, sterilization, and escalation all came with risk. The Caithari had learned something else about humans they fought hardest when they were cornered. Earth's atmosphere was already teetering. Its oceans were poisoned. Yet the resistance was growing stronger, not weaker. If the Caithari pushed harder, would humanity collapse, or would it evolve again into something even worse? Alien whispers began to circulate in the wider galaxy. Rumors of Earth's fury spread through fringe civilizations and outlaw traders. "They're still fighting," they said. "They lost their world and now they want yours." Tales of human ambushes in asteroid fields, stories of planetside resistance commanders who hadn't slept in weeks, who sacrificed themselves just to destroy a single Dominion node, spread like wildfire. To the wider galaxy, humanity was no longer a curiosity. We were becoming a myth, and for the Caithari, that was the most dangerous thing of all. You can defeat an army, you can destroy a planet, but you can't kill an idea, especially one born of vengeance, sorrow, and fire. The Caithari didn't feel fear, but now, for the first time in 1,000 years, they understood it. The turning point was never marked by a single battle or a sudden victory. It didn't come with banners raised or trumpets sounding through the smoke-choked sky. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the way fear began to shift from the hunted to the hunter, in the way Cathari fleets started hesitating at the edge of Earth's orbit, scanning for patterns they could no longer decode. It came in the knowledge that the resistance was no longer merely surviving, it was preparing to strike back, not in desperation, but in fury and purpose. By now, the Phoenix resistance had grown beyond Earth. Relay bases had been established in hollow, doubt moons, asteroid belts had become retooled war foundries, and sleeper ships drifted through the outer solar system, waiting for the signal. From Mercury to Europa, human defiance had spread like a virus not bound by territory, but by message. That message had grown louder, sharper. You thought you ended us, you only awakened us. Cathari's strategy had always relied on overwhelming superiority, a swift crushing of opposition before it could consolidate. But their extended campaign on Earth had become a drain on their resources and their confidence. What was supposed to be a clean extermination had become a prolonged engagement. Worse, the Cathari now faced something alien to them, a species that found strength in chaos and evolution in pain. The more they pressed, the more unpredictable the resistance became. One of the most harrowing developments for the Cathari was the emergence of shadow divisions, elite human strike units composed of enhanced operatives, rogue scientists, defected Cathari sympathizers, and AI-human hybrids. These were not traditional soldiers. They operated in absolute silence, infiltrating Dominion facilities, rewriting AI command hierarchies, and in some cases, turning Dominion weapons on their creators. A single shadow division took down a Cathari hive, cruiser using scavenged propulsion drives, and a virus coded from 1980's Earth malware. These weren't victories by numbers, they were victories of intellect, audacity, and pure spite. But the true crescendo came not from tactical brilliance or technological innovation. It came from something far deeper, belief. Humanity had begun to believe in itself again, not as a broken race crawling out of the ruins, but as a force of nature. The myth of Earth's fury had spread beyond resistance cells. It had become a legend even the stars couldn't ignore. Pirate factions, outlawed species, and rogue AI across distant systems began echoing the message. Humans weren't just fighting back, they were winning hearts. Not through diplomacy, but through the sheer, undeniable will to exist. Some Cathari units, isolated and cut off from the central nexus, began defecting. Not out of betrayal, but confusion. The collective logic that once defined them had cracked under pressure. What the resistance had done, slowly and with relentless intent, was break the illusion of Cathari invincibility. And once a god can bleed, it can be killed. The final stages of the campaign were no longer about reclaiming Earth. Earth had already changed. Its surface was scorched, its skies tainted, but its people, its soul, had transformed. The planet had become a forge, and what it was forging now was a message that echoed across every resistance broadcast, etched into every hull, sung into every coded transmission. We are not your cattle. We are not your error. We are the storm you tried to silence. We are the fury you awakened, and that fury was coming, not just for retribution, but to make sure the stars never forgot.